Hello everyone. I am Moksha from Team CV, which you know is a prestigious techno managerial club of our college, and I cordially invite you all to the inaugural event of CV's latest initiative, Women at CV, which is a sub-community for encouraging the participation of women in STEM fields, that is in fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. To grace the occasion, we have with us Sunaina Sitaram ma'am, a senior researcher at Microsoft Research India. He's an alumna of SVNIT and has completed MS and PhD at Language Technologies Institute, Carnegie Mellon University, United States. After establishing herself as a successful researcher and publishing various papers in the field of code switching, multilingual speech, and natural language processing, she is here with us today to share her inspirational journey and illustrate to us some insights of her work at Microsoft. May I now request ma'am to take over.
Sure. Thanks very much, Moksha and the team at CEV for organizing this. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so I hope you guys can see my screen. And so I thought today, with the time we have, I would start with, talking a little bit about my journey and also talk a little bit about the work that I do and leave some time for you guys to ask me any questions that you have. So I'll try not to take up too much time so that there is some time left for questions. Okay. So I'm sure all of you are very curious to know, um, you know, what I actually did over the last few years and what my journey has been like. And so, like you guys, I was at SVNIT. I did my BTech in the computer engineering department from 2005 to 2009. And currently, as Moksha mentioned, I'm a researcher at Microsoft Research India, which is in Bangalore. So this is the research wing of Microsoft. And what happened in the middle is what I wanted to kind of take you through first. So as I said, so I graduated in 2009, and during my BTech, I got very interested in this field of natural language processing and speech processing and so on. So basically, making the computer understand human language and human speech. And I did sit for placements sort of as a backup, but I was pretty sure that I didn't want to go the traditional route of getting a job, in one of the companies that came for campus interviews. And instead, I wanted to actually apply for some sort of higher studies. So what I did was instead of directly applying for higher studies during the BTech itself, I took 1 year off. And by off, I mean that I actually worked at a startup. And this was a really great experience. So it started off as an internship right after college in the summer, and which got converted into a 1 year position. And this startup basically worked on exactly the things I was interested in. So they worked on speech technologies and natural language processing. So I got lots and lots of real world experience, which I hadn't got during my BTech. And after that, I went on to do the master's in CMU. So I applied to grad school while I was working at Workstar. And then I went on to do a master's and then followed by a PhD at CMU. In between those two, I did an internship at Microsoft Research. And then after my PhD, I did what is called a postdoc. So that is a 2 year position that people do after doing their PhD sometimes. So I did that. And then since the last 3 years, I've been a researcher at MSR. So it seems very, seamless, and it seems like, nothing went wrong in this whole journey. It was very smooth, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do during BTech, and everything just went very smoothly. But actually, that's not quite true. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of the hiccups I had also in the journey, just to sort of, show you that it's always not as easy as it looks. So, for example, during my engineering, I got really interested in this field and so on, and I did some projects on my own, and tried to attend a lot of conferences and so on. I'll go a little more into that. But I tried my hardest to get an internship during my BTech itself, and my dream places were always like Microsoft Research and Google and all those places, and I really wanted to do an internship during BTech, but that never happened. And either I wouldn't hear back from people, or my profile wasn't good enough at that time to get an internship, right? So I ended up doing this internship at this startup, and the reason why this worked out was because they were looking for someone with exactly the skills I had, because they really wanted to build a specific technology, and I had done my BTech in that project in that, basically. So they were very clear about the skills they needed, and I had those skills. And so because it was a startup, it really worked out well, and I ended up learning a lot. I really wanted to do a master's and a PhD. Like, I didn't know whether I wanted to do a PhD or not, but certainly I knew that I wanted to do a master's. But I got the admit from CMU. Now, as many of you may know, that places like CMU are super, super expensive, or most of these private universities are. And the problem with masters is that even though the kinds of masters in CMU are funded, you don't get guaranteed funding before going there. So the way it works is that you go there, you find a professor who is willing to employ you as a research assistant, and then if that works out, then you get full funding and a stipend and so on. So your fee is taken care of, and you can live comfortably and so on. But before going there and before talking to professors, they don't make that guarantee, right? And so I had a really difficult decision to take when I got the admit, because they were not going to make any guarantees of funding. And I didn't want to go there without knowing that I had funding. And also, I didn't want to spend that much money or take a huge loan and do my master's, because I basically by then had decided that I wanted to come back to India. So if I took a very big loan, then I would be forced to stay back there and pay it off, right? So I didn't want to put myself in that situation. So what to do, right? It was a big sort of conundrum. And at the same time, CMU was my dream university. I didn't want to leave the opportunity of doing a grad school there either. So finally, what I decided along with my parents was that I would go for a semester and see if I didn't get funding within the first semester, I would just come back. And it sounds very crazy right now if somebody says that, but that's the decision I had to take because of the financial situation, because I didn't want to spend that amount of money and put myself in that much debt right at the beginning of my career. But fortunately, it worked out. Like, as soon as I got there, I got the full funding and so on, so I didn't have to worry about that. Then actually another thing that happened to me was that there was this one professor who was like my dream professor since BTech itself in CMU, who I wanted to work with, and I really wanted to do my master's and PhD with him. But when I landed up in CMU and I went and spoke to him, he said, "Sorry, I don't have any funding for you. I can't give you I can't take you as an RA and give you funding." So then I was like, "Oh no, I had really been thinking that if once I get into CMU, like all my problems are sorted." But he didn't have that funding, and so I worked with another professor during my masters who did have the funding. I ended up taking a lot of classes and all with my dream professor, and that's how I sort of kept in touch with him. But I actually did my masters with another professor who was also wonderful. Another thing that happened to me was after my master's, I became a PhD student, and the dream professor actually had a slot at that time, and so I became his PhD student. And I was really excited because now finally I got to work with my the person that I wanted to work with for so long, and I got to do my PhD with him, which was like my dream. Then what happened was I was being funded by this project called the DARPA, one of the DARPA projects. I don't know if you guys know what DARPA is. It's the Defense Advanced Research Institute in the US, and they fund a lot of these research projects. And the way it works is that they have a challenge of some sort which runs for 3 or 4 years, and they have a few teams that take part in the challenge. And each team is comprised of many people, like professors and students and so on. And around 2 weeks into my PhD, just as I was feeling great that, okay, I'm going to start working on this topic and so on, DARPA basically cut off our funding. And they said, okay, your team isn't doing well enough. So whatever previous results we had were not good enough. And so they just said, okay, you're not in the project anymore. And unfortunately, DARPA, has done such things before. So you can never say. And so within a couple of weeks, my dream professor came and told me we don't have funding anymore because they just cut all our funding, right? and it was effective immediately. Like I didn't even have, I think I had a few months notice or something. But so I was like obviously very worried at that time. But my professor actually pulled through, and he made it very seamless for me. Like if I hadn't known that this had happened, I wouldn't have even known something was wrong. But I didn't get affected at all. He made sure that I didn't get affected at all, and my fees were paid and my stipend was paid and everything was fine for me. I still don't know exactly how he did it. Maybe I should ask him sometime. But he just found some other funding from some other source, and we managed with that. So that was another thing that happened. um, and then after that, I decided to come back to India. So by the around the end of the PhD, I had already decided that I would be moving back to India. And so I started looking for jobs, and I had a Bangalore constraint also because my family lives here and so on. And so I ended up coming back to MSR India. I had done that internship here, and I ended up becoming a postdoc of the person who was my internship mentor. Right? So it's a small world and it's all interconnected. And that dream professor that I keep mentioning, he's still one of my most close collaborators. I still talk to him every week and so on. So, at the end of the day, everything worked out really well. But what I'm trying to say from all this is that, there are not everything happens exactly the way you want it. And you have to go through that whole journey to reach, a specific point. So, what all did I do at SVNIT itself? So, I was very involved in the ACM SVNIT chapter. I think we started it when I was in first year, and then I became the chair in the third year. And so, throughout the BTech, I was very involved in that. We also did a women at ACM kind of chapter. So, I'm glad to see this initiative at CEV also. During especially the first couple of years of the BTech, I did a lot of paper presentations at the local, like at Mindbend and so on, at every opportunity I could get, just to sort of make myself used to that. And I did some independent projects as well. So I have to say that I was very privileged in some ways because I came from an academic background. My father also happens to have a PhD, and my mother has done a master's and so on. So I had a lot of knowledge and support at home. So even if I was not, necessarily working with the professors in the department, I still had a lot of background at home. And I know that not everyone has that, privilege to do that. One thing that I did that really paid off a lot was I attended a lot of conferences. And at that time, and even now, my interest was in natural language processing. So it so happened that there were a couple of really big NLP conferences that year, when I was in third year in India. So I just went ahead and registered for them and attended them just to know more about the field. And this actually wasn't very difficult to do, because what happens is student rates for these conferences are quite small. And also, you get lots of scholarships and so on. And it's not very difficult to get those scholarships. So at the end of it, I was paying something like only 25% of the original registration fee after the scholarship and the student discount and so on, which was, I think, a very worthwhile investment. So that is where I met people like my dream professor and so on, my PhD advisor and so on, and managed to build a lot of, at least get to know the people in the field and so on. But I think the number one thing that really worked out for me was that I found an area of interest in during BTech that I was very passionate about, and that because of doing things like attending conferences and getting exposure to the field, I sort of knew that this was something that I could sustain for a long time. Like this was something that would hold my interest for a long time, because I gained as much exposure and knowledge about it as possible before jumping into it. This wasn't the very first thing I was interested in. So there were other things as well. Like in my first year, I remember being very interested in crypto and so on. But that didn't hold my interest as long. And this actually ended up holding my interest for much longer, and I still work on it. So another thing I would like to mention here is that NLP and AI and all these things were not very hot when I actually started looking into it. So, like when I was in college and when I was talking about NLP to my friends, nobody had any idea what this was. And AI also was a very abstract term which nobody really, talked about. So, what I picked at that time was not necessarily what was in fashion and what was the hottest topic, but it was something that I personally was really interested in. Okay, so now I'll move on to what I actually do now. And so at MSR India, As Moksha mentioned, I work on multilingual speech and NLP. So there are multiple aspects of what I do. I won't go into much detail in the first two aspects. So one of them is low resource languages. So as all of you may know, today is the age of big data and machine learning and deep learning and so on. And all of these models require a lot of data to actually train them, right? And you may know that there are around 6,000 languages or even more, depending on how you count them in the world. And only around, say, 10 of them actually have enough resources to build these kinds of models. So what about the other 5,990 languages, right? Who's going to build the systems for them? The kind of work I do is actually to look into those kinds of languages and see what we can do to bring them up and also have reasonable systems for such languages. Another thing which I work on is called code switching. So most of you must know more than one language, certainly English and your native language. And you may have noticed that when you speak to your family, your friends, especially in very casual conversations, you keep mixing languages, right? Like, आज का weather कैसा है? Is it cold or and do I need a sweater today? Or आज बारिश हो रही है क्या? Do I need to take an umbrella? So we switch between languages very uh, seamlessly in multilingual societies like ours. And this is not something that happens only in India. It happens in all places where people speak multiple languages. So unfortunately, our current systems don't do a very good job of dealing with this. Like, if there's a chat bot and you give it this kind of input, it doesn't do a good job of actually responding back. So one line of my research is also in this. And the third line is in evaluation. That's what I'm going to go a little bit more into detail about. So I'll start the actual talk of what the title was why is language the hardest problem in AI, right? And I'm just doing a quick time check, so we have time. Okay. So first of all, before we get started on why language is hard, let's talk about what AI is, right? And this may seem like a very dumb question because everybody knows what AI is, but actually, sometimes it feels like everything is AI and nothing is AI, So self-driving cars, yeah, that's AI. And, these intelligent agents like Siri and Cortana, those are also AI. But what about this thing called the paperclip? Most of you are too young, I think, to remember, but there used to be this paperclip in Word that used to try and anticipate your questions and suggest, responses, right? And this wasn't using machine learning to do this. It was basically looking at some patterns and then trying to match those patterns with certain actions and then, just doing that. So is that really artificial intelligence? So it seems like these days what we really mean by artificial intelligence is these three factors. So one is the system needs to be predictive. So that means that based on some input that it is getting that it has not seen before, it is trying to make a prediction. So it's trying to be predictive even in uncertainty, right? Where it's not 100% sure, it hasn't seen that exact case before, but it has seen things which are similar to it and it is trying to make some sort of prediction. It's also adaptive. That means that it gets better over time and hopefully better over time. And then I think the best definition of AI these days is just that it uses machine learning. So these are models that are built using lots of data. It could be supervised, it could be unsupervised, and so on. And then somehow it learns certain patterns from this data and then makes these predictions. And also, if this is a something that feeds back into the system, then it can become better over time, right? So what is AI really good at doing these days, right? So where have we come in AI? So we know that AI is really good at games like chess and Go and backgammon and so on, right? That it has done quite a few years ago. We also know that because of deep learning, it understands images very well. So computer vision has come a long way. We are able to do things like predicting diseases better than experts using images and so on. Speech recognition has come a long way. So, in some languages, actually only in English, we are able to transcribe speech as well as humans. But given enough data, even in other languages, we would probably be able to do as well. We are able to do things like information extraction and so on for Jeopardy, if you know Watson systems and so on. We're also able to do translation quite well. Again, if you have enough data, then we know how to do the translation problem, right? So it seems like given enough data, we are able to solve all of these different tasks, right? AI is able to achieve these. But what about this, right? So here's the sentence. The trophy did not fit in the suitcase. It was too big, right? And now, what do you mean by it here, right? Unfortunately, this is not interactive. Otherwise, I would have taken a poll. But I'm sure all of you will say that it obviously refers to the trophy here, right? And why do we say this? And why is it so obvious for us, right? Well, we know that if the trophy did not fit, that means that the suitcase was too small for the trophy, right? That is one of the reasons it was too small. And so it being big means that the trophy was too big, right? Now the thing is that this actually requires so much of knowledge, and we as humans do it without even thinking about it, right? So first of all, the fact that if something has to fit into something else, then the thing that is fitting into it has to be smaller than the thing that is containing it, right? So that's the very first bit of knowledge, world knowledge that we have, right? We also have this knowledge that a trophy is something that can be picked up and put somewhere else, like it's an actual tangible object. The suitcase is also an actual tangible object, and the suitcase has some sort of hollow in it in which things can be put, right? And we also know that the trophy and the suitcase are both solid objects and so on, right? It's not like air or something like that, or water, right? So all of this contextual world knowledge that we have is what we actually use when we have to solve this disambiguation problem of what it refers to, right? And this is actually from something called the Winograd Schema Challenge, which has a whole bunch of questions like this. And the ultimate goal, of course, is to make machines able to solve these kinds of cases. But right now, machines are not able to do this. So AI is not able to solve this kind of problem, right? And why might that be? So actually, people like Turing, and I'm sure all of you know who Turing is, were extremely perceptive about this. And in 1950 itself, he said that it's not difficult to devise a paper machine which will play a not very bad game of chess. So that means that we can solve things like chess quite easily. But are there imaginable digital computers which would do well in the imitation game? And by imitation game, he means Turing test. And I'm sure people know what Turing test is, so I won't go into that. It's basically fooling a human to think that they're talking to a human being and not a machine, right? So what Turing is saying here is that things like chess are not a very big deal, and it's not difficult to imagine that we will be able to solve something like chess. But when it comes to things like the Turing test, right? It seems like we still don't know. And he said this right before anything even happened. And Bill Gates also recently made this statement like the biggest breakthrough in AI will be when computers can read and understand information like humans do, right? So, which essentially means that language understanding is going to be the thing that is going to be the biggest breakthrough in AI. So, why is it so difficult? Like, why did Turing have his doubts that will we even be able to do this or not, right? So, let's look at this particular survey. So this is basically an analysis that McKinsey did, and you don't need to look at the right now. You just look at the boxes with the colors, and it's basically telling you how good machines are at tasks that humans are quite good at, right? So red means that the machines are very bad right now. Green means that the machines are as good as humans, and yellow means that they're somewhere in between, which means that in some time they will probably be as good as humans. So if you look at all the red boxes, right, natural language understanding is a red box, social and emotional sensing, social and emotional reasoning, creativity, logical reasoning, problem solving, generating novel patterns, and so on. Those things machines are very bad at doing, right? What are they good at doing? They're good at recognizing known patterns and categories. They're good at optimization, planning, information retrieval, right? All those things. And they're okay at some other things. Now, if you look at the right, the blue dots on the right, it basically shows, according to this study, when approximately we can expect machines to be as good as humans. And the y-axis is the years from 2010 to 2080, right? And so for natural language understanding, which is highlighted here, it's basically saying that somewhere in 2060 or 20 somewhere in 2060 or so, machines are going to be as good as human beings in natural language understanding. And if you see, social and emotional reasoning is even further down. Like only in 2070 are we going to have machines that will actually be able to do social and emotional reasoning, right? So whether you believe these exact numbers or not is another question. But it basically shows that these things of language understanding, social behavior, and so on, these are the hardest problems. Creativity also. These are the hardest problems that machines are not close to solving at all. While the other problems like information retrieval and optimization and all those things, those are things that the machines can do fairly easily even now. And why again comes back to the question of why is this so difficult? So let's take an example. So say we have this sentence, I saw a monkey with a banana. So if you close your eyes and imagine this, maybe you see this picture, right? You have a monkey and it's holding a banana in its hand, right? But another interpretation of this sentence could be that you had a banana and you drilled a hole into it and you made it like a telescope, and then you saw the monkey through that, right? It's a little bit of a wild interpretation, but you can see that in some world it may be true, right? Another interpretation could be that you were eating a banana, so you had the banana in your hand, and then you saw a monkey, right? That's another interpretation. And then another wilder interpretation is that you had a saw in the hand and you were going to saw the monkey in half or something like that, and the monkey had the banana in its hand, right? And then yet another even wilder interpretation is that you had a banana which you were using as a saw to cut the monkey into half or something like that, right? So, I mean, obviously, some of these are sillier than others. And as human beings with contextual knowledge, probably most of you would take this as the correct example and run with that, right? And why is that the case? Because it's very unlikely that you would make a banana a telescope. It's also very unlikely. It's very likely that you were holding a banana and then you saw a monkey. Maybe the monkey was coming to get the banana from you, right? But the way you would have said this sentence would have been maybe slightly different, right? Like you would have said, I was holding a banana and then I saw a monkey or something like that. But even then, the fact that there are so many possible interpretations of this very simple sentence just goes on to show that language is inherently very ambiguous, and you can make it more and more ambiguous. There's no limit to how complex you can make your sentences, and this causes problems for any kinds of natural language processing systems, right? So what do you really need as a human being and also as a machine to understand human language, right? One is you need linguistic knowledge. So you need to know the words in the language. You need to know how the sentence structure is. You need to know, what the meaning of the words are, whether words have this, multiple words have the same meaning, whether one word has multiple meanings, and so on, semantics, that is, right? So you need that basic linguistic knowledge. This is not very difficult for machines to learn as long as they have enough data, right? Then you need this world knowledge. So you need the world knowledge about the fact that there is a suitcase and there's a trophy and both of them are solid and so on, right? And they can fit into the trophy can fit into the suitcase and so on, right? Then you need this common sense reasoning that you're probably not going to take a monkey and saw it in half, right? Like that kind of common sense reasoning you need. Contextual knowledge, like maybe if the previous sentence was that I wanted to construct a telescope with a fruit, and then you say I saw a monkey with a banana, then maybe the banana was the actual telescope that you constructed and you saw the monkey through that. If that was the previous sentence, then you're more likely to interpret it that way, right? And then finally you have all these socio-cultural norms. So there are all these different, is there a question or something? um, Sorry, I'm not able to see the screen at all. So I hope that if you want to interrupt me, please, you know, just go ahead and tell me. Anyway, let me continue. Um, yeah. The last thing is socio-cultural norms, and that is basically as different cultures, the practices that we follow while communicating with each other, right? So that is something very difficult to teach to any kind of language processing system. So one question that many of you may have at this point is, you're saying that language is so difficult and, we need so much of knowledge and so on. And there are so many ambiguities in language. And Turing also said it is so difficult. Then what about all these new models like BERT and GPT-3? So for those of you who are familiar with these are the brand new hot models, which are computationally very expensive and really huge. And you know, I won't go into the details of what they are. You can look that up. But basically, the brand new rock stars of NLP, which have really revolutionized the way NLP is done, right? So these models are great, like they are beating all the benchmarks, all the standard test sets, right? So surely they can do this language understanding, right? And things like GPT-3 recently has had so much of hype around it, right? People are able to describe what they want and generate JavaScript, and they're able to write SQL code using just one sentence and so on, right? So people have also tried chatting with GPT, and they found that yeah, it can do some sort of common sense reasoning. It knows that elephants are heavier than mice, and it knows that you know a can of soda is heavier than a paper clip and so on. But some things it is not able to do, like it thinks a pencil is heavier than a toaster. It also if you give it nonsensical questions like how many eyes does the sun have or how many eyes does my foot have, it fails. Like it just says two eyes for everything or one eye for everything. So it seems like these models are doing very well. Like obviously it is able to do some kind of common sense reasoning to say that an elephant is heavier than a mouse, and it's able to do something if it's generating SQL and JavaScript and so on from natural language, right? But what are these models actually doing, right? What are the capabilities of these models? And the most important question being, how should they be used, right? Like, yes, you have these models, but are you confident enough in their capabilities to deploy them for different applications, right? So those are the questions we want to answer. And just going a little more into how good these pre-trained models like BERT and GPT and all are, there are standard benchmarks of the hardest problems in NLP. One of these benchmarks is called the GLUE benchmark. So it's a set of test cases, test sets actually, which will test how good the model is on these very difficult NLP tasks. And these models have had huge improvements on these benchmarks. So you get like 5%, 7%, which are really big improvements, and even more with GPT and so on, right? So one of the tasks that these models are really good at is called natural language inference. So the inference task is set up as follows. So there is a premise. A premise is a sentence which says something. And then there is a hypothesis, which is another sentence. And the natural language inferencing task is basically to say whether the premise and hypothesis contradict each other or entail each other, which means that they don't contradict each other. Okay. So I'll give you an example, a simple one. So say the premise is Sunaina is giving a talk at 4 p.m. on AI. And the hypothesis is Sunaina is going for a party at 4 o'clock, right? So obviously these two are contradictory sentences, right? So that means that the label should be contradiction here. So the machine is supposed to predict whether the label is entailment or contradiction. So it's like a two label problem in this case. What would be an entailment in that case? So the entailment could be Sunaina is giving a lecture on NLP to SVNIT students, right? So in this case, both of them are entailing each other, right? So that's the task. And this task is considered to be equivalent to the Turing test. I won't go into why and so on. But if the machine can solve this task, that means it can also pass the Turing test. And on this GLUE benchmark, on some of the tasks, you can see the numbers in bold in the last row. These models like BERT and GPT and so on, which are these large models I was talking about, they're getting really high accuracies. So 85, 86% accuracies and so on. Right, so that means that these models are doing really, really well on such difficult entailment tasks as well, right? Which means that are they understanding human language? So can we claim that these machines are able to understand language, and we have basically solved the natural language understanding problem? So we can't quite claim that. So one of the problems is these machines are, I mean, these models are very much like black boxes. So we don't know exactly what they're learning and how they're making all these predictions. And on the other hand, we have found that actually breaking these models is extremely easy. So I won't go into the details of all these things, but basically, this is some work that has been done by my colleague Somak in MSR. He found that these models are very bad at doing things like logic, negation, quantification, and so on. Right? So things like, Arthur visited Paris and New York, or Arthur did not visit Paris. It is not able to basically say that this is a contradiction. And these are very simple sentences. Like these state-of-the-art models are not able to do this. So I'll give you more of a concrete example. So this was a very beautiful paper that came out at a NLP conference this year. The table may look a little confusing. So let's look at some examples, okay? So let's look at the second row, that is the Boolean logic row, okay? So name one and name two are from country one and country two. This is the premise. So this is the first sentence. So let's fill in the blanks here. So Sunaina and Alan are from India and US and UK respectively. That's the premise. And the hypothesis is Sunaina is from India. Okay. And what should the model be able to predict here? It should be able to predict that this is a entailment, right? So it's correct. So the second sentence is entailing the first sentence. If the second sentence was that Sunaina is from UK, then it would be a contradiction, right? So all the machine has to do here, so there is no world knowledge, no socio-cultural norms, no common sense reasoning, nothing. All the machine has to do here is that know that name one goes with country one and name two goes with country two. So it needs to understand that respectively part here, right? And what these authors did was they tested three models on this. So BERT, Roberta, and there's another model called Turing, which you can ignore. So it turns out that on such queries, right, if you give these kinds of questions to these BERT and Roberta, which are state-of-the-art model, it fails either 55% of the time or 100% of the time. Okay, which means that these models are not able to do even this very simple thing, which doesn't require any big understanding, right? Let's look at the last one, the numerical row now. So say Sunaina had $20, she gave away $15, right? So this means that she was left with $5. So that is the premise, okay? And the hypothesis is Sunaina now has N3, which is not equal to N1 minus N2. So N3, which is not equal to $5. So say Sunaina now has $30, right? That's the hypothesis. And the machine has to predict whether this is entailment or contradiction. And obviously it is contradiction because N3 is not equal to N1 minus N2, right? But turns out that the BERT system again fails 55% of the time on such simple numerical queries as well. And there are a lot of different examples. If you guys are interested, you can check out this paper. It's a very nice paper which has lots and lots of examples. But basically, this and the previous work also is showing that these models are very brittle. And even though they're doing very well on these benchmarks, they're getting like 85% accuracy and so on these standard benchmarks, it's very easy to break these models. And it's very easy to find cases where they don't work. Okay. So what can be done to solve NLU? And I'll just end now in another couple of minutes. So I basically told you why language is really difficult and where the state-of-the-art systems are and how easy they are to break, right? But what can be done? Is it like a bleak picture or not? So first of all, it's very important to define what it means for a system to actually understand language, right? And not use the term loosely. So if you build a new model and it somehow does very well on these kinds of benchmarks, and then you claim that the model is actually understanding language, that's a very bold claim to make, and it should be made, it should not be used loosely because we still don't know what these models are actually doing and what they're understanding and not understanding, what they're learning and not learning, etc. Right? That is still very much something that we need to look into. The other thing we found is that these models are very brittle, right? It's easy to break them, but on the other hand, they're doing very well on these benchmarks, which means something is wrong with the benchmarks, right? So we need to make better benchmarks that actually reflect real world use and are not as brittle to breakage, right? So that's another area of research that is actively going on. And then before we deploy any of these systems, right, like you guys may go on and become data scientists or work in companies that use AI and so on, right? You need to understand what these systems are actually capable of doing, right? So the fact that they can't do this kind of arithmetic or they can't do Boolean logic or so on, those are the things that you need to keep in mind so that you use them for the appropriate applications, right? There's also the question of bias and so on. I didn't touch upon that, but a lot of these models can cause real harm because of various biases in the data, right? So that has to be kept in mind. And then finally, it seems like machines are very good at doing certain things, right? They're excellent at information retrieval and remembering lots and lots of things, and a lot of things that humans are not good at. And we saw that humans are much better at so many things like social, emotional, creativity, and so on, right? So instead of pitting machines against humans, if we can come up with ways that machines and humans can work with each other and play off of each other's strengths, right? That may be the best way. But it's very difficult to do this and to build scalable systems where machines are working with humans. So this is an ideal case scenario, but it hasn't been realized very successfully yet, right? And I just want to leave you with this last thing. about what you can do, I'll be happy to take more questions and so on. But I strongly believe that as good researchers, as good engineers, and so on, we should not be getting carried away by hype, and we have to have a very critical eye on the claims that people are making, and look at them, and only after getting enough evidence actually believe the claims that are made, right? And at the same time, it's our responsibility also not to hype things, and not to use words like understanding and so on very loosely. Then again, you don't need to do what everybody else is doing. So I know that ML and so on are very hot right now, but just because everybody is doing it doesn't mean you need to too, unless you're genuinely really interested in it. And I think this is a good time for you to find something that you're really interested in and stick to it for as long as you can. It's okay if you change your mind and do something else later. And finally, if any of these research questions, especially the deep ones, where you have to think a lot and so on, if that interests you, then you should consider doing a PhD. It's a very rewarding experience, even though it's a long journey. So I want to end with that, and I'm happy to take any questions in the remaining time.
The session is now open for Q&A. Participants, please unmute yourself and ask your questions, or you may use the comment chat box.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Ma'am, actually, if is there any new concept like we are, and if someone is introducing new AI technology, then how they are going to collect the data?
Um, you have to collect the data for the technology, for the application that you're trying to build it on. You may be able to use data from some other source also, right? So it depends on what you're trying to actually build. If it is similar to something else, then you may be able to reuse the data. Otherwise, you have to collect it from scratch. Like, data collection is a very important part of building any new technology. So you can't avoid it. And it really depends on what exactly you want to do. If you can be more specific, I can answer better. Any other questions?
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, like I would like to know how should a beginner, like, who is like I'm in my final year, so
Mhm.
how should like I prepare to enter in the field of machine learning and like natural language processing, and how what kind of projects should I focus on that will be like helpful for me to apply like in industry applications?
So are you interested in doing a job in machine learning, or are you interested in higher studies?
No, I'm currently targeting job.
Okay. Yeah, so I think there are lots of online courses and so on, right, that you can do. Definitely. I would definitely take up some of the projects in those courses, because just listening to lectures is not very useful. I think to really understand some of these concepts, and also there's a lot of math behind many of them, right? Then you have to actually implement and do things. So I would definitely take some basic algorithms and actually implement them. I would also try and do some non-deep learning before getting into deep learning, or while doing deep learning as well. So I've seen that a lot of people jump into deep learning directly, which I don't recommend. Like, it's better to also know a few algorithms that are not deep learning, because uh, deep learning is not the only thing that is used, right? And a lot of simpler algorithms make sense. So I would find an AI course, find a machine learning course online which has both deep learning and non-deep learning, and then do as many of those courses as possible, but do them like properly with all the assignments and the projects and so on. That will help you build skills, practical skills, and some experience as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sure. Any questions about MSR or about what SVNIT was like 11 years ago?
Yes, ma'am, we would love to know about your BTech experiences at SVNIT.
Yeah, sure. So I have to say, I have to admit that I focused much more on all these other things like doing projects and so on than my academics, which I wouldn't say is ideal. But I'm very happy that SVNIT gave me that freedom to actually pursue that. And also encouraged me to attend a few conferences and so on. It wasn't always easy. I had to convince people that I was serious about what I was doing and I wasn't just doing it to get out of attending classes. But I'm happy that I got that platform, and I got exposure. So many things like the ACM SVNIT chapter, Drishti also I was part of for some time. All of those things really helped get a general understanding and get a good peer group of people. Yeah. So in that way, it was really nice. Yeah.
Now, what would you prefer, like online courses or some uh, uh, some type of concerts, like they are teaching some workshop or something?
I think if you can motivate yourself and be very, like diligent and consistent, then I think the online courses are a very good option because most of them are free and they're very high quality, right? So they are from the best people in the world, best researchers in the world, best teachers in the world. So I think those are really good. Only thing is you have to. Nobody's going to check whether you're doing it or not, and nobody's going to be behind you, and you may not have a peer group who will motivate you either. So one thing that I have seen that works for people is that they get into groups and they do these online courses and they kind of motivate each other to stick to it, because the biggest problem, and I myself am guilty of having done this, is starting lots and lots of courses and not completing any of them, so or not doing a good job of or just watching the videos and stopping at that. So I think maybe starting a small group that 5 6 people all want to do the and doing machine learning course, then everybody does it, everybody agrees that okay, every week we will do this much, you know and like shares their assignments and checks each other's assignments and all. Doing it like a peer group may actually motivate you. I am a little wary of companies that charge a lot of money for all these courses, because I mean they're really trying to make the most of the hype that is there around these subjects, and they may not have the best interests in mind. So I would just be wary of that, but I understand that a very structured thing like that also may work for some people. Yeah, so this is a great question. So it's actually wonderful, and I have to say that every day I look forward to going to work. And now, unfortunately, we are all stuck at home. But the peer group that we have is excellent, but the culture is also really great. So it's a very open culture, very flat, non-hierarchical culture, especially in Microsoft Research. And we are given a lot of freedom to work on what we want. And again, this is something in Microsoft Research that is very special, that we get to choose what we want to work on, and we don't have to necessarily work on a product related topic. And eventually, yes, some of our research may go into some products, but that is not a prerequisite when we start working on something. So it is up to us to try and pick topics that are of relevance to the world and to the company and so on, which may not be relevant right now, which may only be relevant 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line, and we are still encouraged to work on that. So in that sense, I would say that it's a very uh, open culture with lots of freedom, lots of flexibility, and great colleagues, like some of the best minds in the world. Yeah, so there is a question on chat which I can see. says, what are opportunities for a graduate student to work at MSR or even Google Brain? What helps the most? Reaching out to researchers through email or applying directly for the programs if they exist? So I'll speak for MSR because I'm not aware of Google Brain's process for this. But there are internships at MSR India and also at the other MSRs all over the world. And you can apply on the portal for sure. It's good to have an application on the portal since sometimes they ask you to upload like SOP and reference letters and so on. It's always good to have that. But I think it's very important to follow up by email to researchers. And here, one important tip I would like to give is that we have seen people who write to the whole lab, right? So people who write to 10 people or 15 people in the lab, and then we get those emails. So say there is somebody who's interested in NLP, okay? And there are 3 people in our lab who work on NLP. Instead of writing only to the 3 people who work on NLP, they would write to 15 people, and all those rest of the 12 people will forward that CV to the 3 of us, right? So that is not a good thing because it seems like this person is just spamming everyone possible. And we get lots and lots of applications for internships, as you can imagine, right? We get a lot of them. So instead of doing that and just sending emails to everyone like that, picking 1 or 2 people who you really want to work with genuinely, whose work interests you, looking at what they have done, reading their papers, if not in depth, then at least skimming through them and trying to get an idea of what the research area is that they work on, and sending an email with how you could contribute or what skills you have that they may be looking for. And also if you have worked with somebody else, also mentioning that person and saying that that person could give a reference for you. That is what would work, right? Because otherwise we see lots of emails with just essentially they're a template that are sent to everyone and they have no relevance to anything that we are doing at all. So those we just ignore because we get so many emails, right? So a very pointed email to people who you really want to work with. This is difficult to do as a BTech student because you may not have gone deep into a specific subject, but even then, right? Even then, sending it only to a few people and not to the whole lab. And also, if you have worked with somebody else, like a positive reference from that person makes the biggest difference. Like if there is somebody that you have worked with and we know that person, without seeing your CV and all those kinds of things, we are going to first call that person and ask, is this person good or not? Right? That is the biggest indicator of whether this person will do well in our internship or not. So that's the thing that matters the most. So I would say that reaching out to researchers, but also not to everyone and not just spamming people. Yeah. This is not my office cabin. Somebody is asking whether I can show my office cabin. This is actually my home office setup, and the reason I have glass is so that it's a little soundproof. But none of us are in office. At least till January, they have told us not to come because of COVID. Yeah. But my office cabin is home office is bigger than my office cabin, but my office cabin is very nice. Okay, there's one more question. Looking at the pace AI technology is growing, many people fear that AI will rule humans in future. What is your take on this? Yeah, so I think that I don't think I'm fearful that AI is going to rule humans. I'm not fearful that AI will take over jobs and so on. What will definitely happen is the nature of jobs will change, and that has been happening, right? So industrial revolution and so on, right? Like people are not doing as much manual labor as they did earlier because machines are doing that for them, right? And is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. I think people are doing, it may move people to more creative jobs if a lot of the manual work is done by machines, right? And I don't think that AI is going to rule humans, and I don't think we are anywhere near that yet. What can happen, and what is already happening, is that AI systems are being used to cause real harm. This is not ruling in that sense. It's not like some robots are, deciding that they will take over the world. It's not that. But there are AI systems that are used in resume filtering, for example. Okay, so it's basically like 100 people apply for a job, and instead of a recruiter going through all the 100 resumes, an AI system will scan the resumes and then basically show the top 10 resumes to a human being, right? So it's reducing the effort by that human being. But how is it doing that, right? And is it being fair when it does that? So there have been studies that show that people who have, say, African American sounding names, right, or women with exactly the same resumes, those will get filtered out because these algorithms are biased, right? So that is causing real harm, right? So it's not like ruling humans, but it is already causing harms. You may have also heard about like all the controversy related to facial detection and the fact that it's not able to recognize like African American non-white faces or women's faces as well as white faces and so on, right? So that kind of thing already is happening, and that is what I think we need to be more worried about than an army of robots taking over the world. So it's 5 now. I don't know if you want to continue, or I have 10 more minutes so we can, yeah. So someone's asking, what was your favorite spot in and in or around SVNIT? Favorite time pass? I didn't really do a lot of time pass, but I used to like, I guess, I used to be like honestly in my hostel most of the time. I used to like walking along the road, like just outside SVNIT. That was nice. But in SVNIT, I used to like the Drishti room was next to the ATM. I don't know where it is now. So office cabin in cell phone is not there, unfortunately. Sorry, I have never taken a picture. Actually, we are not allowed to take pictures inside, but I haven't taken a picture. You can look up online for Microsoft Research and you will get Microsoft Research India. If you look at the image tab there, you'll find a lot of pictures of our like the uh, basic layout and all that, if you want to see that. Yeah, so favorite spot, I really don't know. I mean, my hostel room probably, which is a boring answer.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
like for job, like if we are working on some type of startup, and if we will not successful in that, rather than doing a startup, would you prefer to go with internship or not?
I think internship is always good if you can do it. The problem is getting an internship is not always easy, and getting a good internship is not always easy. But internship is a great way to test the waters, and it's a good thing for the company also because they can test you before they give you a full-time offer. I think so. Internships are always good. Are you talking about an internship after finishing your BTech instead of a job, or like a
No,
summer internship?
no, ma'am, summer internships.
Yeah, I think you should definitely do summer internship. So I think one of the things that I don't know how it is now in SVNIT, but at that time earlier when I was there, like we used to just waste our entire summer, right? Used to just go waste, and I think that is like really really bad. Like every summer in BTech should be used as productively as possible, and should be used in an internship or should be used working at a company, or worst case if you can't find anything, then just self motivating yourself and doing some project on your own, right? Because all other universities do that, right? I mean, all the IITs and all send their students for internships, and we keep complaining about the fact that we don't get opportunities, right? But we just need to make use of whatever free time we have and do these things on our own, even if we don't get the actual internships. So I think internships are good. You should take whatever internships you have. Those are very good opportunities to learn and to potentially get a pre-placement offer also.
Ma'am, can we mention that we have worked on some kind of a startup and we are getting failed because of this reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should not mention your fail. You should mention what you have learned from your experience and what skills you have. But yeah, sure, why not? I mean, you don't even need that as a reason, right? Internship you can do anyway, whether your startup works or doesn't work. Internships are just a way to learn and to basically do something for get some experience, right? So yeah, sure.
Ma'am, we had rolled out a registration form, and in that we have received a question that
Mhm.
can a non-CSE student crack companies like Microsoft, and what are the skills required to get into these companies with non-CSE courses?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so Microsoft is a giant company, right? So there are lots and lots of different roles, and in fact, there are lots of non-technical roles also. You don't have to be an engineer to be in Microsoft, and those are all very good roles. Like nothing wrong with them at all. So there are lots of roles, but if you want to do it as a fresher, maybe it's a little harder. I would say, like, if people want to really get into Microsoft as software engineers, then, and if it's not possible like immediately after BTech, then you get really good experience for a few years in some other companies, and then you can always move, right? It's not like the company that you do right after BTech is the one that you will stay in for the whole life, right? So you can always. I've seen a lot of cases like that of people who have worked for many years in some other company and then have moved on to places like Microsoft. About the non-technical roles, there are also a lot of roles like project management, program management, and so on. So usually people after MBA, they do that. Lots of those also in Microsoft that are there. And then of course research roles and all that are, those are different because there you need a PhD. But there are also lots of non-technical roles and sales roles and so on. Lots of people get into that also even after doing engineering, like if they're interested in the sales part of it, technical sales and all that. Yeah, so somebody's asking, you've done your PhD from Carnegie Mellon. What is the major factor why students choose to pursue research abroad rather than in India? And what is the major difference between research in foreign universities and Indian universities? So I would say actually that the research done in the top universities in India, like IISc and some of the IITs, that is at par with the research that is done, abroad as well. There is no difference, major difference between the two. So I think just the number of opportunities are fewer here. The number of professors who you could potentially work with, who are doing that top level research, is less over here, and it's higher, probably less, more of a pool abroad than there is over here. That is one factor. And then there may also be, like, some people may be more biased towards foreign PhDs compared to Indian PhDs and so on. But there's no, I mean, I wouldn't even say that that is true anymore. Like even in MSR, we have lots of people from lots of US universities and European universities who have done their PhDs there, but we also have people from IITs and so on. So I wouldn't say that there's a huge difference. Yes, there is a difference in terms of funding. You may get funding more easily. The funding situation really varies. Sometimes US funding is very low, sometimes India funding is very low. So it depends on when you are really applying. And the departments and so on, the exact topics of research that are happening in India may be slightly different from the ones happening. There may be some groups that don't exist in India at all, which only exist abroad and so on. But as of now, I see no reason, if you really want to do it in India and if you're really good, then there are like top people in India that you can work with also. Okay, so I will take one last question, and that is any last minute. Uh, so I'll take one more very quickly. Has Microsoft India unemployed their employees during COVID-19? Not that I know of, but I actually really don't know because Microsoft is so huge that at least I haven't seen anything in the news, so I'm guessing it hasn't. Okay, so this last question I will take: motivational advice to female students of SUNIT to dive deeper into STEM fields. Would love if you can share. So yeah, okay. So I think the number one thing is confidence and self-belief, and it's difficult to do this. Sometimes being a woman, because of the way society is, sometimes inadvertently people may say things or uh, imply things that they don't really mean, or sometimes they even mean, to indicate that just because you're a woman you cannot do certain things. Like you're not good at maths, or you're not good at coding or whatever. So just having that confidence and self belief to power through that, and also lifting each other up, right? So I'm very happy to see that the women in CEV group has been formed, because I think talking about these things to each other really helps a lot. So talking to each other, helping each other out, especially with issues of confidence or self doubt, I think that is the uh, that is something that is very important to do. And another thing is to find good mentors. So finding somebody who you would like to become, you know and that person doesn't have to be like very 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 senior to you. It could be somebody who is just like 3 or 4 years senior to you, right? Who has maybe somebody who has started working 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe it's a family friend, maybe it is somebody you met somewhere, maybe it's somebody you worked with at an internship. Having somebody like that just to talk to, and learning from their mistakes, and talking to them about career journey, and also personal things that you're going through. Having a mentor like that, finding a mentor, and sustaining that relationship for some time, I think that is also something very important. So yeah, I think we can probably stop here.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was indeed a really insightful session. Like the participants and everybody learned a lot with the simple overview that you gave, supplemented with some really nice examples. It's truly an inspirational to everyone who is here. Thank you so much for your time, ma'am. And thank you all the participants for joining us.
Yeah, it was nice to come here, and thanks everybody. Bye.